They came to the Mojave Desert expecting chains and taught to fear the American savage. But instead of a prison, Afrika Korps prisoners of war found something far more terrifying. A nation so confident in its power that it treated them not as enemies, but as paid workers, shattering years of propaganda with a single astonishing gesture of decency. The engines of the American convoy had finally fallen silent, leaving behind an acoustic vacuum filled only by the relentless rasp of cicadas and the metallic groan of hot steel cooling in the twilight. For the group of German prisoners packed inside the canvas-covered trucks, the cessation of motion brought no relief, only a fresh wave of paralyzing dread. Among them sat Feldwebel Hans Riemer, a veteran of the Afrika Korps who had surrendered only 3 months prior in the collapsing chaos of Tunisia. Hans had spent years fighting in the North African crucible, and he braced himself for the customary chaos of capture. Instead, a wave of scorching air washed over him, bringing with it the scent of dust and an uncanny resemblance to the desert they had just left. He squinted against the harsh sun. Stretching before him was a landscape of yellow sand, flanked by a jagged purple mountain range that looked hauntingly like the Atlas foothills. The American guards, in their wide-brimmed campaign hats, watched them with a weary, almost bored indifference. Hans whispered to Klaus, the young radio operator beside him, "We never left, did we? They brought us to some forgotten corner and called it America." Klaus nodded, the lie of the land confirming the worst of their propaganda-fueled fears. The Reich had warned Americans would show no quarter to captured Germans. Their belief was they would be tortured, starved, or forced into slave labor until this barren, sun-baked landscape outside Camp Papago Park, Arizona, seemed to confirm every horrifying rumor. Yet, there were no chains, no shouts. Instead, a tall, pragmatic-looking American sergeant pointed them toward the sturdy wooden barracks. "Roll call in 10 minutes, he called, his voice slow and calm. "Don't step outside the fence line. There's a lot of countries out there, and you'll find it doesn't forgive mistakes." Hans noted the word, forgive. The guards looked utterly relaxed, leaning on rifles. Hans found his certainty wavering. Was this a cunning psychological trap? He had been prepared for defiance, but this quiet, arid waiting game was far more unsettling. He rubbed the fine sand from his eyes. If this was a prison, it was built not of steel bars, but of sun and sand. As they walked, Hans noticed a strange metal cylindrical object attached to the side of the mess hall. What in the name of God is that? He wondered. This desert, he sensed, was a trap set with the unknown. The strange cylindrical object Hans had seen proved to be a giant water cooler, dispensing clean, ice-cold water. A surreal and unbelievable luxury in a place that looked exactly like the water-starved hell of the North African front. The shock deepened the moment they entered the barracks. The structures were solid wooden buildings with actual floors, bunks, and screened windows. This substantial infrastructure suggested permanence, a profound confidence the Afrika Korps had lost years ago. Hans felt a profound wave of sensory overload. The air inside was clean. There were no immediate odors of decay or dead. Hans realized the enemy operated on a fundamentally different scale of logistics. The war they were fighting was about soap, plumbing, and effortless delivery of resources. The true moment of psychological warfare arrived an hour later at the mess hall. They expected thin soup. Instead, they were greeted by the deep, rich smells of roasting meat, fresh baked bread, and strong coffee. The cook smiled as he slid plates across the counter. Roast beef stew, thick with potatoes and carrots, several slices of soft white bread, and a small wedge of apple pie. Hans stared at the plate, his mouth suddenly too dry. He thought of the desperate food lines in Tripoli. "It's a trick," Klaus whispered, his voice trembling. "It must be tainted or poisoned. They want us to suffer." The officers had always told them Americans were incapable of honor, but the American guards simply watched with calm boredom. There was no demand for gratitude, only the simple, confident delivery of a meal that contained, by regulation, 3,200 calories. Hans took a cautious bite. It was real. It was tender. It was a physical, undeniable proof that everything he had been taught about his enemy was false. The enemy they had been taught to despise was feeding them better than their own army had. The shock was not in the meal's taste, but in its overwhelming implication: the sheer, effortless abundance of the American machine. The plate of beef stew and apple pie was the first truth that penetrated Hans's hardened, propaganda-shielded mind. If the enemy could afford to feed their captives so easily, it meant the war was not a contest of equals, but a vast, insurmountable logistical imbalance. Hans looked down at the food, the physical manifestation of America's quiet confidence, and wondered what other terrifying comforts awaited them in this well-ordered desert prison. The barrack structure was built on the principle of structured distraction. Within a day, the prisoners of war were introduced to a small room, stocked with a battered upright piano, stacks of board games, and a library. For Hans, the room full of books felt like a calculated provocation. The books were in both German and English, covering literature, technical manuals, and American history. This stunning adherence to the Geneva Conventions, which their own side had flouted, was profoundly unsettling to the defeated soldiers. It was here that Klaus found his escape. Klaus gravitated toward the history section, seeking answers in the enemy's own narrative, trying to reconcile the ruthless conqueror he had been promised with the democracy described in these pages. The American logic was subtly devastating. Why spend precious manpower guarding miserable, rebellious men when you could keep them busy, educated, and calm? It was psychological warfare of the most polite and sustained kind. The greatest difficulty was the mandatory letter writing. Hans sat staring at the blank page, gripped by the impossibility of describing the roast beef and running water to a mother enduring aerial bombardment. He could not write the truth, and writing the expected lie felt like a profound betrayal of the unexpected decency he had encountered. Klaus carefully composed a letter, speaking in vague, coded terms about the unexpected order of the camp. He felt a desperate need to transmit the truth that they were not suffering. The propaganda machine had not only shielded the Reich from the truth, but was now shielding the families of the prisoners of war from their sudden, confusing relief. The comfort of the camp became the hardest secret to keep. Hans stared at the piano. An elderly Austrian corporal began softly playing a melancholy waltz. The gentle melody should have been comforting, but it only amplified the unnerving question. What kind of enemy tries to ease the pain of capture with music and books? The answer, he suspected, was an enemy that knew it had already won the war for their souls. The work detail began before dawn. The men were told they were going to work, and this was a command they understood. Labor was punishment, exhaustion, and the price of defeat. But the expectations of brutality were once again elegantly dismantled. They were given stout leather work gloves, tools that were clean and in excellent repair, and sturdy denim overalls. They were driven for nearly an hour, crossing the border into California's Imperial Valley, a fertile agricultural oasis managed by massive, roaring, gasoline-powered tractors. They were assigned to harvest acres of cotton stretching out beneath the vast American sky. The foreman was a lean, sun-worn civilian named Mr. Davis, who treated them with pragmatic respect. His instructions were simple. You work steadily, you get paid. You don't work, you go sit back in the camp. My concern is cotton, not flags. Hans and the other Afrika Korps men were stunned. Mr. Davis treated them not as defeated enemies, but as temporary, paid, hired hands. And the pay was real. The Geneva Conventions dictated a small wage, and the American system adhered to it perfectly. Each prisoner received 80 cents a day in scrip, redeemable at the camp commissary. Hans felt the paper script in his hand, a wage earned from the enemy. This was not slave labor. It was a bizarre form of employment. The dignity inherent in the transaction was far more unsettling than any physical would have been. As the morning wore on, Hans noticed Klaus struggling with the rhythmic work. Hans stepped in naturally, showing the younger man the trick of snapping the bowls quickly. They worked side by side, their cooperation utterly devoid of military rank. This shared labor felt like a brief, impossible return to normalcy. The crushing blow arrived just before the noon break. A guard unfolded a newspaper. The bold print was visible. Allies take Paris. The word Paris hit Hans like a strike. The war was being lost rapidly. He was losing his homeland, yet here he stood, being paid by the victor. The contrast was undeniable. The enemy was confident enough to treat its captives with decency, while its armies crushed the last vestiges of resistance. Hans stared at the paper. He understood the great work detail was a demonstration of a power so immense it could afford to be humane. If they could pay their prisoners to labor while winning the war, what chance did his shattered army ever truly have? The work detail provided food and wages, but it could not satisfy the prisoners' hunger for the truth of the war they had left behind, a truth carefully concealed behind a wall of censored letters and official American news that they simply could not trust. The only way to pierce the propaganda bubble was through desperation and ingenuity. A rumor began to spread through Camp Papago Park. A group of captured engineers had secretly constructed a radio receiver. The parts were scavenged from workshops. If discovered, the consequences would be severe, but the desperation outweighed the risk. Hans agreed to participate in the clandestine listening sessions. One humid night, Hans, Klaus, and a handful of trusted men slipped into a narrow, unused maintenance closet. The colonel, illuminated by a shaded flashlight, hunched over the crude device. After agonizingly slow adjustments, a distant voice spoke in flawless German, a Voice of America broadcast delivering news the Reich strictly forbade. The news was a catastrophic torrent: relentless Soviet advance, continuous Anglo-American aerial of industrial centers, and irreversible loss of oil production. This wasn't defense. It was a military of unimaginable scale. Hans listened, gripping the workbench until his knuckles were white. He had suspected defeat, but to hear the quantified reality, cities reduced to rubble, was a profound shock. Klaus began to tremble, softly repeating the name of his hometown, which the voice had just described as 90% demolished. The radio transmission was proof of the absolute, overwhelming truth of their loss. The reality of the war was far worse than the comfortable imprisonment suggested. The Americans didn't need to lie. Their logistical power and military momentum spoke for themselves. The greatest lie, Hans realized, was the one the Reich had constructed. The enemy was patient and fair because they were already winning completely. As the colonel quickly dismantled the radio, Hans felt his old loyalties give way. He stepped out into the silent desert night. The fear of had been replaced by the quiet for the homeland he knew was suffering. He knew the war was over, but to grasp how completely, he needed to see the victorious nation itself. The defeat Hans heard crackling through the radio was abstract. To bridge that abstract truth with the human reality of their captors, a simple shared moment of play was required. It happened one late afternoon during a break from the monotonous cleaning of the motor pool. The prisoners were sitting listlessly in the shade, watching the American guards smoke and talk. Suddenly, Sergeant Miller, the pragmatic guard, pulled a worn leather ball from his pocket. He tossed it to another guard in an easy arc. The two men began to play catch, their movements fluid and rhythmic. Hans, who had seen similar games in old pre-war American films, found himself drawn to the unusual ritual. The game seemed utterly pointless yet entirely absorbing, an emblem of the confident idleness only a wealthy, secure nation could afford. "What is that foolishness?" Hans muttered to Klaus. "Why do they throw the ball back and forth? There is no goal, no structure." To the German soldiers, this casual play was utterly incomprehensible. Sergeant Miller noticed the scrutiny. Through the translator, he explained, "It's called baseball, and this part is just warming up." Hans, still skeptical, asked why. Sergeant Miller shrugged. "It's a game of patience. You wait for the right pitch. You learn to trust the umpire, even when you disagree with him." The guard pointed out the boundaries and the need for every player to know their position. To Hans, this was an accidental lesson in American culture. He saw not just a game, but a metaphor, a system built on rules everyone had to follow. Authority commanded respect through shared agreement. This was the antithesis of the rigid authority he had always known. Encouraged by Sergeant Miller's calm demeanor, Klaus blurted out, "May we try?" Sergeant Miller grinned, opened the gate, and tossed the ball toward Klaus, who threw it wildly off target. Guards and prisoners erupted in simultaneous laughter, a spontaneous human connection that transcended the barbed wire. Sergeant Miller patiently stepped into the compound and showed Klaus how to grip the ball, explaining the soft, flowing arc of the throw. Hans watched as his own men shed their rigid posture and dissolved into a clumsy, joyful effort. They were covered in dust and sweat, but they were genuinely laughing. In that moment of shared absurdity, the deeply ingrained hatred that separated them began to recede. Hans saw Miller not as the enemy guard, but as a man of quiet patience. The greatest difference between the two nations, Hans realized, was not the size of their armies, but their capacity for organized, rule-based play. This enemy was not interested in them. They were interested in fair rules. But this demonstration of ordered play was a quiet preparation for the ultimate act of respect they were about to witness. The war was a mathematical equation of resources and logistics, but the true terror of American power was seeing the entire equation balanced without effort. An opportunity arrived for the prisoners when a shortage of supply trucks required the guards to take a small detachment of men, including Hans, on an unscheduled run to a civilian warehouse near Bakersfield. They were heavily guarded, but for the first time since their capture, they were about to see the undisturbed, working heart of the enemy's nation. As the truck approached the outskirts of the town, the air of quiet confidence that permeated the camp was replaced by a dizzying display of industrial might. The prisoners saw rail yards stretching farther than the eye could follow, filled with long trains carrying hundreds of boxcars, all moving with a synchronized, effortless rhythm. Every track, every machine, every worker seemed to fit into a comprehensive plan. When they arrived at the immense concrete warehouse, Hans stepped out of the truck and felt a wave of sensory overload. Inside, mountains of goods were being sorted by swift conveyor belts. There were endless stacks of canned food, bags of flour, barrels of oil, and boxes of cigarettes, goods that had utterly vanished from Europe years ago. But the most staggering sight was just outside the loading dock, a row of gleaming, colorful automobiles parked next to one another. American civilians, untouched by the war's deprivation, simply parked their cars and went about their day. To the Afrika Korps men, whose entire concept of war was based on frantic rationing, this was bewildering. The contrast between the civilian abundance and the grim, rationed existence they had left behind was the final, undeniable proof of their inevitable loss. Hans watched a young woman casually pull up in a bright yellow coupe, enter the building, and emerge minutes later carrying a sack of what looked unmistakably like sugar, a substance that cost a fortune on the European black market. The calm lack of stress on her face demonstrated a confidence so profound it bordered on arrogance. This nation did not need to struggle. The men's propaganda had labeled Americans as corrupt and materialistic, but in this warehouse, Hans saw not moral failure, but relentless, unyielding efficiency. The industrial capacity that built the B-17 bombers that damaged his homeland was providing this woman with sugar. As they drove past a local shopping area, Hans caught sight of a large window displaying a cornucopia of untouched goods: bananas, oranges, and, most incredibly, large bottles of Coca-Cola. He turned to Sergeant Miller. "How can you have so much? Our people have nothing," he asked. The sergeant shrugged. "It's how we do things, Hans. We make it, we move it. The war doesn't stop the system." Hans realized that the war had been lost long before the first tank battle, lost to the superior scale of a civilian system his leaders had fatally underestimated. The final, irreversible act of moral subversion came not through food or freedom, but through the solemnity of a passing. One chilly Mojave morning, an older corporal, Richter, who had been suffering from pneumonia since his capture, peacefully in the infirmary. The news spread through the camp not with panic, but quiet resignation. Every soldier knew the reality of wartime: hasty battlefield burials. Hans and his comrades braced themselves for the expected final indignity. But the Americans, driven by their bureaucratic adherence to decency, had other plans. The camp commander notified the prisoners that Corporal Richter would be accorded a military funeral, conducted according to United States Army regulations and full adherence to the Geneva Conventions. The men were permitted to build a simple wooden coffin. Hans, Klaus, and a small procession of fellow prisoners of war were allowed to attend the ceremony, escorted by American soldiers. The scene at the graveside was profoundly moving and entirely unanticipated. An American Army chaplain read a brief prayer. Crucially, a German-speaking non-commissioned officer read a few lines of a traditional German burial rite. Hans watched, a lump forming in his throat. This enemy was treating there with a level of solemn respect that spoke volumes about their own moral code. Sergeant Miller approached Hans afterward, carrying a small, crude wooden cross with Richter's details painted on it. "We make sure they're remembered, Hans," Sergeant Miller said softly. "They fought honorably. That deserves respect." Hans thought back to the battlefield in Tunisia. Here, in the heart of the enemy's nation, the dignity denied to Richter in battle was restored in captivity. This act of profound, unsolicited respect delivered the final, crippling blow to Hans's wartime cynicism. It was a visible, tangible demonstration of American moral confidence. A nation so secure in its victory and its values that it could afford to extend honor to a captured the propaganda had insisted the Americans were savages. But savages do not provide full honors for their enemies. As Hans and the men marched back toward the camp, the desert no longer felt like a hostile trap. It felt like hallowed ground, a testament to unexpected human parity. Hans realized the conflict had become less about the enemy and more about the lies he had been told about them. He was discovering a kind of personal freedom he hadn't known even when he carried a rifle. The spring air across the Mojave carried the unmistakable tension of history reaching its final, decisive moment. The men of the Afrika Korps worked, but their focus was distant. Their ears, straining for the slightest sound of radio news or the hushed whispers of the American guards. Then, on a Tuesday in early May, it happened. The camp commander called an immediate assembly on the parade ground. The prisoners of war formed their ranks. The commander, a stout, middle-aged officer, stepped onto the small stage. His voice was solemn, utterly devoid of triumph. "Gentlemen," he announced, "the German High Command has surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe is over." A profound, unnatural silence descended upon the parade ground. This was the moment they had been conditioned for years to fear, the ultimate. Yet there was no anger, no celebration from the American side. The guards stood quietly. For the German prisoners, the news was one of deep disorienting. Their homeland, which they had fought to protect, was now a ruin in the hands of the victors. That evening, the compound was eerily quiet. The men sat on their bunks, speaking only in low murmurs. The guards, recognizing the gravity of the moment, brought in extra rations of coffee and tobacco, a final, quiet gesture of respect across the wire. Sergeant Miller approached Hans. He simply extended his hand, palm up. Hans stared at the gesture, then clasped it firmly. "It's over, Hans," Sergeant Miller said simply. "Go home." The word home struck Hans with unexpected force. The camp, sterile and strange as it was, had offered security and comfort. Now they face an absolute blank future. The American victory, experienced through fairness and decency, had prepared them in an unforeseen way. They had spent months seeing the sheer, unstoppable power of a functional, decent society. Now, they were expected to take that lesson back to the ruins. Hans looked out at the Mojave. The desert, which had mirrored the desolation of North Africa, now seemed different. He saw not the trap he had expected, but a vast, open space that had served as a school. He realized that the hardest part of the war wasn't the fighting, it was going back, taking with him the unbelievable truth he had learned in captivity. The camp had stopped being a prison the day the baseball game started. Now, on the day of it had become something else, a strange, temporary sanctuary. The ultimate freedom would be the moral freedom to leave the lies of the past behind. The war was done, but Hans knew his personal journey of reconciliation was just beginning. The journey home was long and fraught, a painful reversal of their initial capture. Instead of the deceptive heat of the Mojave, they found the real, profound of a defeated Germany. Hans Riemer stepped off the repatriation train in Hamburg in late 1946, carrying the memory of American generosity. His hometown was a panorama of rubble, the air thick with the dust of buildings. But in the ruins, Hans carried an invisible asset: the organizational clarity learned in the Arizona desert. He found work as a foreman for a construction team, applying the American rules he had observed: clear commands, fair wages, and a focus on long-term stability. Years later, Hans was running a successful small construction company. One rainy Tuesday, a small, heavily taped package arrived from America. Curious, Hans sliced through the tape. Inside, wrapped in brown paper, was an old, scuffed baseball. Tucked beneath it was a slightly faded photograph: Hans and Sergeant Miller smiling under the Arizona sky. The guard was Sergeant Miller. Hans stood there, the cool, worn leather of the baseball a shock against his palm. It was the very ball they had tossed around outside Camp Papago Park. There was no letter, only the shared memory of a game that had been a lesson in human parity. The baseball was more than a souvenir. It was a physical reminder of the place that had saved him, not from physical harm, but from the mental destruction of hatred. It represented the moral victory of the victor who chose to educate rather than destroy the defeated. Hans learned that thousands of German prisoners of war had returned home with similar stories, becoming quiet ambassadors of American decency, helping to build the foundations of a new, democratic West Germany. Hans hung the photograph on the